It's my privilege to introduce our guest today, Pat Ferrell of Sequent Consulting. I've known Pat since her days as a student in the OPWL program, back when we called ourselves Instructional and Performance Technology. We finally met in person when Pat came to Boise for her graduation. As instructional designers and performance improvement practitioners, we know that task analysis is important. A good task analysis provides a working representation of exemplary performance that IDs can use to finalize their analysis. And savvy IDs will mine the contents of a good task analysis throughout the design and development phases of a project. That's all well and good, but how do you actually do this stuff? In this first of 2 webinars, Pat will share tips and tools that will help you establish your own credibility, develop effective working relationships, establish clear roles and responsibilities, and manage the workflow. She'll also answer your questions. Pat, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's my honor, and I'm delighted to be part of this Talking Shop series. Looking forward to having a good dialogue with everyone who was kind enough to share your afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the country, with me. Just to give you a little bit of background to further go into what Steve said, I am currently with a small boutique consulting firm. I've been with Sequent for about 18 months. Prior to that, I was with Accenture Consulting for about 4 years. They're one of the big 4. Many of you might have either heard of them or worked with them. So I have both kinds of experience that I can share with you. I have also managed the training departments at several large retail organizations. And prior to that, I spent about 20 years in the retail industry as a merchant, a buyer, a district manager, and a planner. So I have a fairly in-depth background that I can share with you. And I have found that for the work that I do, which focuses on the retail space, having that industry background has allowed me to be pretty effective at things like task analyses and working with large organizations on broad change management efforts. So hopefully I can share a little bit of what I've learned with you all. And I'm looking forward to getting your questions as well. So why don't we go ahead and start with the objectives, and I'm going to try to make sure that I click through the slides here. So just to give you a sense of what I would hope that we can cover tonight, I want to talk about fundamental strategies and best practices when you're trying to do the task analysis phase of a project. When Steve and I first talked about this, we had so much ground to cover that we thought it might make sense to split this into 2 webinars. So tonight we'll talk about some of the basics, and then follow up. I believe we talked about maybe the spring doing another advanced webinar that can take this a little bit further. So tonight, what we really want to do is talk about ways in which you as an instructional designer can and need to establish your own credibility with clients and why that is so very critical to the work that you're going to be doing. Talk about some of the most effective ways to build strong working relationships. And I can share with you, if we have time, some of the pitfalls to avoid when working with others on a project. I have learned some of these the hard way, and I'll be happy to fess up to those. Some of the best practices for establishing roles and responsibilities. That is one of the most important things that you can do to help guide your work and make sure that your clients are happy with the results. And then how do you manage the workflow? And what are some of the tools that can help? And there are also some tools that I would urge you to perhaps avoid because they're a little bit cumbersome. And then hopefully we'll have 25 or 30 minutes at the end of tonight to talk about your questions and find out what's on your mind. And I'm very much looking forward to that part. So let's start with personal credibility. When you are working with a client, whether you're part of a big project team or you're working on a very small project, you really need to be an expert partner with your clients. And so what does that really mean? When we talk about this, clients really do expect you to come in knowing a lot about their business, knowing a lot about their challenges, knowing a lot about their objectives, and being able to really give them good guidance. You are a consultant. Whether you have a consultant title or not, anybody who is in a role like yours is expected to be able to come in and have a deep level of expertise and be able to guide people who need your help. And as part of that, what I would urge you to do is do your homework. Google is probably the best thing that ever happened to us when it comes to this. I actually am old enough to remember the days when we would have to go to the library and look up industry information. You don't have to do that anymore. You can Google an awful lot about a company. You can find out what are the industry buzzwords. You can understand, if you read annual reports, what are some of the challenges that the company is facing. Even if you don't think that that's necessarily germane to the task analysis that you're doing, all of that homework will allow you to understand more about the company's objectives, some of their challenges, and allow you to speak the language of the organization. And that is absolutely critical. If you are on a big enterprise resource planning or ERP kind of project as part of your task analysis, ask the project managers to give you any and all project documents that you can get your hands on, including technical specifications for systems, implementation, software, any of that kind of stuff can be very, very helpful, primarily in helping you understand what are some of the things that people might be asked to do. You know, if you're doing a task analysis, you're doing it because something is changing. People need to learn how to do something that they don't today know how to do. So you need to get yourself up to speed on the software that they'll be working with or the business process that is changing. So don't be reluctant to ask for all of those documents and read them. Even if you don't understand everything that you're reading, more of it will sink in than you think. Don't be shy about asking for things like organizational charts, job descriptions, any of that kind of background data. You'll be kind of surprised, I suspect, to find out that a lot of companies don't have good job descriptions, and org charts are sometimes hard to come by, believe it or not, but ask for that. Your client should be able to provide it to you. Asking for time with key project team members, and I've got a couple of initials here that for some of you might be new. So the IT team, obviously, that's the folks in the information technology side. If you're on a big project, we usually are working with a group of people called systems integrators. So the SI team is another group of people that you will probably want to sit with if you're on a project that involves something beyond just a simple task analysis. You sit down with them, talk to them about the project, talk to them about the objectives and some of the buzzwords, and listen very carefully so that you can come in and start to have informed conversations with your client. Yeah, the other thing that you want to do, and you have to be kind of very artful about this, you also have to come in and talk about why you are there. What is your experience? What have you done that has positioned you to be in this role of trying to help guide a client who has a challenge? Bring up past experiences, whether they're graduate school is, that's perfectly valid experience. Many of you are working professionals, so don't be shy about bringing up things that you've had successes with in the past. Offer up ideas, come in with drafts and templates or a point of view to say, in the past, when I've done a task analysis, this is an approach that I like, or here are some templates that we might be able to use to get us started. So always come in being ready to showcase your own expertise, because you do have it, and don't be shy. Just don't be boastful either. You've got to be kind of careful about not overdoing that. You don't want to be braggy, but you do want to very quietly and confidently position yourself as an expert partner with your client. And also readily acknowledge the expertise of others on the team. If you're working on a big project, or even if it's a smaller project and there's other team members involved, be graceful and gracious about acknowledging the fact that you are an expert, but they may come in with an idea that's absolutely wonderful, and you certainly want to acknowledge that, and if you can, use it. So don't feel like you're out there on your own. If others have something that they can bring to the table as a professional, you certainly want to welcome that expertise and, wherever possible, use it. So once you have been able to kind of position yourself in as an expert, you're on the team for a reason, you're here to do a job. The next thing that you have to do is really figure out How do you then work with others within the organization or on the project? And I'll refer to projects a lot because that's typically the work that we do. In my line of work, we're on great big projects. So I'm hopeful that you can take what I'm saying here and also use it if you're on a smaller, less complex task analysis. And somebody asked the question, what's POV? It's point of view. And thank you, Nicole, for answering that one. When we talk about working with primary clients and secondary clients, let me clarify a little bit of terminology here. A primary client is typically the person who has hired you or brought you onto the project. Sometimes it's a human resource person. Sometimes it may be a project manager. Sometimes it is actually perhaps a vice president, for example, of merchandising in a retail environment, someone who's in the business. So clients can be internal, they can be external, depending on whether you are hired with an organization or if you are coming in as an outside consultant. But regardless of whether they are internal or external, there's some kind of working rules that I would encourage you to adopt because it can save you a lot of heartache up front. First of all, find out what your primary client's preferred method of communication is. Do they like to have an email followed up by a phone call? Are they a person who really prefers to always chat in person and would prefer that you come into the office or drop by their office? Some people are quite fine with what we call drive-by hallway conversations, where you might be walking down the hall and you just pop in. Other people absolutely want to have scheduled times with you. So out of courtesy and respect for your client and to avoid some heartache down the road, have a meeting when you first start the work and say, let's just talk about how you like to work. And then I, as your instructional design partner, will tailor my own work style around yours. Meeting times and styles. Again, when do they want to meet? How formal do they like to be? You always, always, always want to come in with an agenda. Some clients actually like to see the agenda ahead of time. And that really forces you to think through what you want to accomplish during a meeting. So it's not a bad thing to make sure that you're always a good 24 hours ahead of meetings. How do they want to review the work product? So you're going to be, as you develop your task analysis, doing drafts, having various people review those. So understanding from the client's point of view, do they like to have 24-hour advance notice so they can read it and then they can just hand you back a printed copy with their comments? Do they like to do a collaborative kind of thing with a Google document? Do they want to review a soft copy? Ask up front, what do they like to do in terms of product reviews, work product we call it, so that you can then tailor your work schedule accordingly. One of the areas that can get a little bit tricky sometimes, and we see this a lot when we are in consultant roles, your client may have a team of people, direct reports, that you will be working very closely with. And I always find it's helpful to discuss with my client up front, what is my role and how does my client want me to work with their team? Sometimes if you are being brought in as an outside consultant, you may be asked to kind of take some team members under your wing and give them some guidance and some help along the way. Other times you may be almost reporting to someone who works for your client. So understanding that relationship and how you fit into the client's existing team is a very important thing to do. So those are kind of some basic block and tackle, logistical kind of things. But when I'm working with secondary clients, they can be stakeholders, subject matter experts. They can also be, can you all see the comments, the chat? Who are secondary clients? They can be the direct reports. They can be other stakeholders. They can be people who are impacted by the change, but may not be necessarily the person to whom you are reporting. But you do have kind of a dotted line responsibility to them. Does that, type in a yes or no if that clarifies the question. one of the questions that I like to ask everybody with whom I interact, and does everybody understand what a stakeholder is? A stakeholder is anyone who has, as it sounds, a key stake in the success of the project. So that can be anyone from a project sponsor, typically at a very senior executive level, all the way down to the end users. And we sometimes forget that they are stakeholders, but they are absolutely key stakeholders. I generally have a lot of meetings up front with stakeholders. And one of the questions I ask almost every one of them is, what's keeping you up at night? And how can I help? Depending on the level of the person and their role on the project, you can get some pretty interesting insight when you ask that question. And let's say that you're coming in thinking that you're doing a task analysis for what appears to be a fairly straightforward systems implementation. You're rolling out a new tool and everybody needs to learn the new tool and their job is going to change a little bit. So you come in thinking that this is going to be fairly simple. And you ask the question, what's keeping you up at night? And all of a sudden you may be hearing things like, I don't think we really have enough people to support this change. I don't think we have the skills for them to be able to adapt to this new tool. You may actually hear from some stakeholders, I personally don't think that this thing is worth the time and trouble. So that can kind of raise some red flags around some potential adoption issues that you may have. Oftentimes what I find when we are implementing systems changes is that there is an underlying skills gap that may need to be addressed along with the actual tool that we're trying to train people on. And that is oftentimes uncovered when I ask that question. So it can help give you some additional insight into some challenges that you may run into down the road, or it may also kind of steer you a little different direction as you are trying to do your task analysis work. It may actually force you to broaden your efforts a little bit. And we can talk more about things like that when we do the second webinar, because that gets into a little bit more of the tactical piece. But the other thing that question does is it establishes you with the client as a person who has their best interests at heart, and that you are not coming in necessarily with a concrete point of view about what their problem is and what you need to do to fix it. What you're doing is you're saying, I'm here to become your partner and help you solve a problem. Help me better understand what your problems are. So it's a great win for you as a professional, especially when you're new on a project. So someone asked a question, and I apologize for not knowing who it was because it came over the OPL. What are secondary clients? Another term that you probably need to understand a little bit is matrixed organizations. There are very few cases anymore in which we have a direct line report. When we work on projects, we work with lots and lots and lots of people. Some of them belong to the client, so they are the client, her team, other people within the organization. Many times you are being asked to work with other outside consulting firms, technical people. It can be any number of people, and you all have to play in the same sandbox, and you all have to achieve the same goal. And that's sometimes harder than you think it should be when we're talking about performance improvement and instructional design work. So one of the things that I would urge you to do if you find yourself in that situation is educate the other people on the team about your role. Why are you there? What is the purpose of the ID work that you're doing or the change management work? This one is equally applicable there. Make sure that they understand what your role is and that you understand their role so that you don't overlap and that you also don't have any gaps. And this is particularly true if there are other consulting groups on a project, which there oftentimes will be. You do not want to be in a position where somebody says, that's your job and not mine, or I thought you were doing it and you're not doing it, or we've already covered that with the client. What are you doing here? So sometimes those things can get a little bit tricky. So what I typically would like to do at the beginning of a project, if I find myself in this situation, is ask my client to set up a meeting with the key people from the project team. And we have a kickoff meeting and we'll say, here's what I'm here to do, and help me understand each of your roles and responsibilities. Here's my objective. Here's what I was hired to do. And can I reach out to each of you when I need to for technical insights or expertise on the business process, whatever it is that I might need. You need to have effective working relationships with the team. You also need to oftentimes educate them about the work that we are doing. And I can't stress enough how important that is. And then when it comes down to it, if there's something on the project that you think needs to be done, and this may not apply to your grad school work, but it will in the real world, step up to the plate. If there's something going on that's not necessarily assigned to you, or it's, quote, not your job, offer to do it anyway if you're capable of it. When you are working on a big project and it's crunch time and somebody says, gee, we really need somebody to step up and print documents or go buy coffee or do whatever, step up to the plate and do it. It will put you in such good stead with the rest of the team and show that you are putting the success of the project ahead of your own personal goals. It'll be a big win for you. So this next little section really kind of goes into more detail about roles and responsibilities. And you want to make sure that you have this conversation very early. You want to make sure that you involve the right people, and we'll talk a minute about who that is. Remember that this can be a politically sensitive topic, even though you wouldn't think it would be. This is one that I have found over the years can oftentimes create some angst. And one of the things that you will often struggle with when you're doing instructional design work, and Steve and I were laughing about this during one of our prep calls, everyone at some point in their life thinks that they have been a trainer, and everybody is convinced that they can train better than anybody else. And so here you are coming in to head up what's probably going to be some kind of a learning project, and you are going to have to deal with other people who at some point in their life conducted a training class or they trained somebody, and so they are convinced that they are the world's best trainer ever. And why are you here? Because they're going to tell you how to do it. And believe me, we've all been there. And I see an amen. Yes, and everybody, it is the truth, unfortunately. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but what you have to do is you have to be able to kind of handle that a little sensitively. So let me go ahead and flip to the next slide, and we'll talk through a sample breakdown of how I have tried in the past to really define roles. And then I'll give you some buzzwords and some phrases that you can use to kind of put those trainer expert people in their place. So this is, I call this a sample roles and responsibilities chart, but it's actually one that I developed for a major grocery store chain when I was on a project up in Boston. And we actually had an executive project sponsor, we had a business sponsor, we had a project manager, we had an IT lead and a technical team, we had a group of super users, we had internal client learning and development resources, then we had me and all of my people. And I was managing a team of 7 or 8 consultants. So I had to put together this chart so that everybody on this giant project team understood where we all were playing in the sandbox together. I have found that the words that I've used here can be helpful in having people feel included where you need them to feel included, and yet puts some boundaries around whose job it is to approve your work versus who gets to review your work. And there's a big, big difference. You don't want the head of the IT team reviewing your work from an instructional design perspective, not their job. But when you talk about the training development work, you certainly want to go to the IT people and say, could you review this for technical accuracy? So if in this case, I was putting in an Oracle system and it was quite broad, I wanted the IT people reviewing it for the technical accuracy. Did I capture the steps that it takes to navigate through your system. Is the terminology correct? Do I have everything in the right order? You guys are allowed to review it for technical accuracy. I want you to review the training strategy because as part of the project team, everybody needs to understand what the training strategy is. But the only person who gets final approval on that is the project sponsor and or the business sponsor, because those are the people who have the key accountability. In this particular case, I also had client learning and development resources, including the Senior Vice President of Learning. So and somebody asked, where would the Schmies that you worked with fit into this chart? That's a great question. They fit in almost every one of these buckets. The business sponsor in this particular case was able to give me the business process, information, and content that I needed. The business sponsor was a director level role in this particular case, very well versed in the business, came from the business and was on the project for the 2 to 3 years that we spent getting this stuff rolled out. So she had that in-depth frontline knowledge. I went to the IT lead to get technical content. So they were a SME. I also went to, and this is one that I would encourage you guys to do, super users and frontline managers. They are the people who are doing this on a day-to-day basis or managing the end user teams. And a super user, for those of you that may not be familiar with that term, is typically an end user who has been tapped for their skill at, first of all, learning new processes or applications. They oftentimes are asked to become internal coaches and trainers for their peers. Sometimes you'll call them peer experts. Super users is typically the word that we use. They are end users who are given additional training and are expected to then kind of become the trainer within the department on an ongoing basis. Awesome source of content for you as a subject matter expert. And even if you don't use them for your initial content, I would encourage all of you, as you draft your task analysis, bring your super users and your frontline managers into the conversations to review what you have written and give it a gut check to say, does this sound like it makes sense? Did we capture it all? Is this really how things happen? The managers, the directors, the vice presidents, I will tell you, I work with a lot of them. They don't have a good sense oftentimes of what's happening on a day-to-day basis. They're wonderful people, but their job is more strategic. So if you're doing a task analysis, I would encourage you to get subject matter experts who are lower level to validate some of the tasks. Or you may find that you're living in a world where people are saying this is how it ought to work, and yet the subject matter experts on the end user side are going, but it doesn't really work that way. So make sure that you're broad enough in your scope to capture the reality, as well as this is what we'd like exemplary performance to look like. Then you've also got to say, but where are we starting? Or what are the roadblocks or the challenges to getting to that exemplary performance? I will tell you, vice presidents and directors typically can't give you that point of view. You need to go down the food chain a little bit. So I want to be sensitive to time. I'm absolutely happy, and Steve, I'll defer to you if you want to send out my email or how you want to do that. If you guys have questions at a later date, you're welcome to shoot me an email. We can set up a separate call. So use a chart like this, whether you use this one or something like it. I find that having this conversation up front can be very, very helpful in terms of avoiding some headaches down the road. Okay. And then lastly, I'm going to touch very briefly on managing workflow so that we can set aside enough time to take questions from you guys. The most important thing to remember, yeah, I do. Somebody asked, Grayley asked, do I present this chart to the group? Yes, I do. I typically present that chart. And what I've learned, by the way, is I do it in a big group setting to avoid having a lot of people raise their hand and argue with me, by the way. There are times when you want to do things in a big group to minimize the opportunities for pushback. And that's one that I will get everybody in the room. We'll go through it together, and it's kind of a speak now or forever hold your peace sort of thing. And it almost always works well that way. But always, 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 before you present anything to anyone, run it past your primary client first. You never want to blindside your primary client by going and showing anybody your work until they have seen it and approved it. It's a courtesy that you want to make sure you afford to your clients. Workflow tools. Rule number one about workflow tools is do not let the workflow tool dictate how you spend your time, because you need to get the work done rather than filling out project plans. I have that conversation with every project manager with whom I've ever worked when they want me to build my training plans in Microsoft Project, and that is overkill. You will spend more time managing project than you do managing work, and that's not the intent. I love building very simple Gantt charts in Excel. And this one, I don't know if you guys will be able to read it well on this screen, but hopefully if you download the presentation, you can. Typically what I do is I try to chunk the work out a little bit. And I'll say, I need to have an end date. My go live date is X. And I start to back up. When do I want to pilot the training? When do I need to have materials done? When do I need to have the strategy done, et cetera? And frankly, I just block it out in a Gantt chart view in Excel. They're easy to read, they're easy to edit, people can understand them, and you can share it with the client, with the project team. You can build out your detailed work plan that lives behind this, but don't go too bananas with building out complicated workflow tools. And this even may be more than you need for the task analysis that those of you that are in the grad school program that you need for class. I will tell you, I think the most important workflow tool that you've got is your calendar. The biggest challenge that you will probably have in working with SMEs is getting time with them. And not only the initial meetings, but then time to review your work, time to go back and ask questions. Your SMEs are very busy people. And so make sure that you set up all of those calendar meetings well in advance. And even if you end up canceling some that you don't need, people are never, you're not going to hurt anybody's feelings if you cancel a meeting. So I would encourage you to do that. Do know, though, that flexibility is going to be really, really critical. You can have the best plans in the world and they will blow up. So just be sure that you are able to accommodate and be a Gumby. I used to actually buy Gumby toys for my teams back in the days when I was running training departments in retail organizations, because it's always a last minute fire drill. And then one of the other things that can help you with the workflow is knowing when you have to raise your hand and go back to your client or go above somebody's head and say, I have been on Steve's calendar 3 times. He owes me an edit. He owes me a review. He keeps canceling meetings. The project, my work is at risk if I can't get some time with Steve. So I'm going to go to my client and say, can you help me? Or I'm going to go to Steve's boss and very politely say, can you help me find some time with Steve, because my project is at risk and I can't seem to find time on his calendar. Can you give me some advice on how I might be able to accommodate my schedule to match his? But that knowing when to escalate and to whom is a very important part of managing your workflow, because again, like fire drills, it is likely to happen. It can be a little bit uncomfortable for you, especially if you are relatively new to your role and you're not quite as comfortable having those challenging conversations with people. So it's a good thing to clear with your client in some of your early conversations, is to say, hey, if I'm running into some problems here, or I'm having trouble getting on people's calendars, help me understand here within your organization what's the best approach to use, and just be sure and clear that ahead of time. So that's probably one of my biggest things that I had to learn the hard way. So, okay, I'm only 6 minutes over. That's pretty good for me because I could talk forever. It's your turn to ask me questions now. When you begin working with the SME, do you show up with a draft of the task analysis that you've created, or do you and the SME work off a blank sheet? That's a great question. I would, as a general rule, encourage you to always come in with a draft if you are able to. Most of the time, the work that we are doing as instructional designers or performance improvement consultants is very foreign to our clients. Even those who think they're training experts because at one time they taught a class, they don't have the same methods and the same procedures and the same tactics that you guys are learning. And all of the things that you're learning are absolutely essential to good instructional design. So when you say a task analysis to a client, chances are they don't have a good understanding of what you're talking about. So I would encourage you to do a couple of things. Show them examples, if you have them, of past task analyses so that they can get a better sense of what are you trying to accomplish here. And then if you can, and to whatever degree you can, come in with at least a template to start the conversation. And that same thing holds true, by the way, anytime you're talking about working with SMEs at any stage of a project, always try to come in with something for them to respond to, because you will get much better results and it's a better use of everybody's time than if you just come in and say, hey, can we kick some ideas around? So great question. Absolutely. One of the things that I said earlier I would give you were some, another question popped up I'm going to answer. I want to circle back on something real quickly. The key phrase when you've got a client or somebody on the project team who says, oh, I've been a trainer and I know how to do that, or when I was a trainer, I did it this way, or in my experience, and when they're kind of playing in your sandbox and they really don't know what in the world they're talking about, one of the things that I will say is that is a great idea. Let me take that under consideration. And you just stop right there. And you very respectfully say, wow, that's a great idea. Let me take that under consideration. And you jot a note and then you can ignore it. So that's one of those phrases I use over and over again. So here's a question. When you work on projects, are you part of a team that does the task analysis, or is a task analysis something you alone are responsible for? That can depend on the size of the project and the size of the team. I mentioned earlier in my introduction that I used to work for Accenture Consulting, which is one of the biggest of the big four. And I typically had a team of people reporting to me when I was managing projects for Accenture. When that was the case, I would oftentimes be part of a team that was working on a task analysis. And oftentimes that included a client counterpart. Now that I'm working for a smaller team, and one of the things I love about working for a smaller team is I will develop the strategy in the morning with the executive vice president and then go do the task analysis myself in the afternoon. So it can vary depending on the size of the project. Sometimes it's almost easier to do it yourself, frankly, than to have to work with a lot of other people. When you're working with other people, that requires more organization on your part. You have to make sure that someone is ultimately in charge and accountable. And so if you are working on a project team, make sure that you have very clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and that everybody knows what their own, what is my role on this project? What is your role, and who's ultimately running the show? How do you handle a client who is certain they need training in a specific area when they have not conducted a front-end analysis and don't see the value in one? That's a great question, and that does happen a lot. One of the questions that I ask them is, I'll say, well, tell me why, what prompted you to ask me for some training in that area? You go back to the old, what's keeping you up at night? You can handle that a couple of different ways. You can ask them, help me understand what prompted you to ask the question, what led you down that path, and what makes you think it's a skill gap. Have you had some conversations with managers and they've pointed out that their people don't have skills? Or can we talk a little bit about the situation, even if you don't challenge the client, but if you just say, help me understand the broader picture. Talk to me a little bit about the organization. Talk to me about that business unit. Do you have a resource? Are there, if we're going to develop training, let me understand the bigger picture. Do we have resource constraints? Do we have people who may not believe in what you're trying to do? Do we have people who want to do well, but they have workload issues or other things? So you can sometimes guide that conversation back to the need for a front-end analysis without necessarily talking front-end analysis. And honestly, as a general rule, I would encourage you not to use too many of the terms that we use internally. Clients don't know what a front-end analysis is. It sounds big and scary and consultanty. But if you say, I really kind of want to understand the area in which your people are working and what some of their challenges are, it's the same thing as a front-end analysis, right? You're just talking in terms that are a little bit more relevant to the business. So hopefully that'll give you at least a starting point to have that conversation. And yeah, that happens quite a bit. Patrick asked, have you managed the technical knowledge jargon within an organization? Oh, how have you managed the technical knowledge and jargon within an organization that you simply don't have the time to learn to the same level as a Schmidt? It's a great question. Learn as much of it as you can and try to find the people on the team, and there will always be one or two, that you can go to and say, hey, for the price of a glass of wine, could you help me understand all this stuff? Don't be shy about bribery. Inviting somebody to lunch or breakfast or coffee or a quick drink after work and say, hey, you know what, I'm kind of new here. I'm pretty good at what I do, but you guys have some terminology I'm not quite understanding. Could I buy you lunch and maybe you can talk me through it a little bit? So that's sometimes a good way to manage that. What do you do with clients who are sure they need training but haven't done any type of root cause analysis to confirm that? Oh yeah, basically the same question as we had before. You're going to run into that a lot. And one of the things that I think is important when you have those early conversations with your client is to help them understand that as much as most of us love training and we're passionate about learning, it's only 20 to 25% of the solution. The best training in the world isn't going to offset bad business process, lack of management support, wrong-sized resources. So sometimes you have to just set the expectations up front as to what training can and can't do. And then whether you're managing the change management more broadly, or if there's a change management role that you can go and talk to, you kind of have to partner up and say, at the end of the day, people have to apply it, they have to adapt to it, they have to adopt it, they have to believe in it. Training is it's a starting point. It's a great starting point, but it's only a starting point. We've also told Schmies that they are Waterwalkers. We'll never know what you will, but we can work together to represent what you do in ways that others can do their job more like you. Yeah, that's a great way to say, is that they are the experts, and it's our job to kind of take that expertise and package it and share it with others. Yeah, that's an awesome response. I like that very much. When you get into the whole question around what are the underlying problems, what are the real obstacles to success? If you think back early in the presentation when we were talking about that question that I suggested you ask, what's keeping you up at night? One of the reasons I love that question is you can refer back to it and say, Ted, when we were talking, when I first came onto the project, you told me that you thought that maybe you had some managers on your team that weren't quite supportive of this new initiative that we're trying to roll out. So even though I think the training is great and it's, we're doing everything we can, help me help you get those managers to adapt and to support this, because until that happens, the training's not going to go very far if people aren't encouraged to actually apply it on the job. So going back to that initial question, whatever you heard there can help you with some of those difficult conversations when it comes time to say, training's great, but it's not the whole story. So keep that in mind. Another question, when you do a task analysis, do you start diving into the details or do you work in layers, starting with major tasks, decomposing them into subtasks and steps? Absolutely start with major chunks and then start to dissect it and peel back the onion. The other thing that you can do with a task analysis, it depends on your client and the culture and how skilled their people are. Sometimes what I've done is I have actually engaged some of the end users, and we've laid out the tasks, the big chunks. And then what we may do is actually get little sub teams of end users to help us fill in all the details, because they oftentimes know that nitty gritty. The other thing that that does is you begin to build a coalition of people who are involved in the project. And because they are being asked for their opinion, they're being asked to engage and give their point of view, they become mini SMEs for you. You will find that they are much more willing to embrace the change if they feel like they had part of defining either what is our current state or what do we want our future state behavior to look like. So to whatever degree you can, engage the people who are going to be using the tool or the process that you're training on. How do you address clients that have an aggressive gatekeeper that is determined to be the owner? They never happen. What techniques work to validate and acknowledge them while also moving the process forward and reclaiming control? Kill them with kindness. Absolutely. Try to make friends with them. Go out of your way to seek them out on topics where they can share with you and where you can actually use their expertise. Acknowledge them publicly. That is probably the biggest win for people like that. People like that are basically, I think, needy. They need to feel like they're the center of attention and they're in control of everything. You certainly don't want to go toe to toe with them in public. And that can be, this is where people like that are oftentimes a little bit more challenging than you'd like them to be, because they will sit in a meeting and they will argue with you. So what I oftentimes will do is try to form a relationship with them early and try to really understand what makes them tick on a professional level and on a personal level. Sometimes getting, how's your dog, how's your kid, how's your wife, whatever. Sometimes that works really well with people like that. If you find that they are in fact interrupting the project or throwing challenges out just to be ornery, sit down with them and say, I'm hearing some concern and I want to understand what's got you worried, because I've been asked to make sure that X, Y, and Z happens, and I'm sensing that you're not necessarily a fan. Can you help me understand where you're coming from? Try to keep it very even keel and very much a tone of, I'm really here to help you, but I've been given an objective and I have some accountability back to the client. And I'm sensing that perhaps we're not on the same page. So maybe you and I can sit together and talk about how we can come together and align on this. But kill them with kindness and acknowledge them for everything, even if it wasn't their idea, is probably one of the most successful techniques. How do you differentiate your approach to task analysis when you are targeting new processes being implemented for change measures versus existing processes where training is needed for performance improvement? It's an excellent question, and there are some significant differences. So if you are in a situation where you have a new process, you want to be more broad in reaching out to SMEs. And the reason I say that is that when business processes are being developed, one would think that the right people would be in the room. Oftentimes that's not the case. Usually there is somebody who is driving the business process work, and there may be a lot of other people involved who should have signed off on it and may or may not have been brought into the loop. So when you're working with a new business process, one of the most important things to ask, I think, is who are my SMEs and who are my approvers and reviewers? Because what you don't want to have happen is that you go to a lot of work and you build a lovely, elegant task analysis around a new process, and then find out that some director somewhere is not even in favor of the process and you have to start over again. So broaden your approach and make sure that you're reaching out and socializing it with the right people, and make sure that you are staying very close communication with your primary client. If you are beginning to sense that some of the people are not necessarily aligned with the process itself, so that you can get a partner if you say, hey, you know what? I'm beginning to sense that there are some directors or vice presidents that are not in favor of what we're trying to do. Can we take a step back and make sure that before we go down this path, that we're not, uncovering a bigger problem? I think when we're talking about existing processes where there may be additional training needed, I think that's a little bit, I hate to say simpler because it's never simple, but I think it's probably more straightforward. Typically fewer people that you have to interact with, perhaps a more direct line of sight to who's the decision maker. But when it's a new business process or a new system implementation, you need to be very broad in your scope. How do you negotiate for Schmidt release time during early project negotiations and later during the project itself? How do you ensure that you get exemplary performers rather than people who are merely available? It's another great question, and frankly, it is one of the most challenging things about working on a project. The 80-20 rule applies. There are 20% of the people who have 80% of the expertise, and we oftentimes tap the same people over and over and over again during the life cycle of a project, and we squeeze them to the point where there's nothing left of them. Prior planning and education on a project is probably the most helpful thing to avoid that situation. So if you can map out early how much time is expected of a SHME, and I apologize, I didn't even think to put a slide in there. I have one. Steve, I'll dig it out and see if I can send it to you. That we actually talk about when do we need SHME time during the various cycles of a project. Early, you need them a lot. Toward the end, you need them a lot. And then in the middle, you may or may not need them so much. But typically what I will do is actually map out in hours how many hours of each person's time I need, at least on a monthly basis, if not by week, so that they get an understanding of what this means in terms of added workload. Excellent question. Looks like we've got time for maybe one more question. What are some of the more interesting responses to your "how can I help" question? Oh, that's a great one. I get everything from, can you convince the vice president to promote me, to I don't think you're going to be successful with this because we've tried this before and no one's ever been able to make it work. That's always a really great way to start a project. To I think this is a great idea. I wish you much luck, but personally, I don't believe in it, so I don't want to have anything to do with it. I would say that last one is probably the one that unfortunately I hear the most often is good luck. I'm not sure that I want to have anything to do with this. And then I oftentimes get a lot of people who will share with me information that is very broad in scope, more about the underlying cultural challenges that an organization is facing, the fact that they don't have enough resources, or those kinds of things. So it can vary depending on the personality of the person, but oftentimes it reveals some interesting insights that will help you understand the culture of the organization or the particular business unit, and also gives you some good sense of how to work with the individual people. So I'm sensing that we're probably going to have to wrap up. If you have additional questions, Steve, let's figure out a way that they can send them, because I'd be more than happy to try to respond in writing if need be, because I know we're just about out of time.
Okay, I'm thinking that other people can email their questions to me, and then
Perfect.
I can funnel them to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Pat, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
This has truly been an honor, guys. I hope that you found it to be helpful, and I'm very much looking forward. Hopefully we can regroup at a later date and continue the conversation.
We'll do this in the spring, if not sooner. So
I love
Pat,
it. Okay, that's great.
So much.
Thank you all very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. This concludes our webinar and the recording. Thank you very much.